So what we're going to do today is we're going to assemble this Unshaven Fuzz, which is a DBE project here. It's a real small project, should fit into a 1590A enclosure. The idea of this is it's a very extreme, kind of a splatty fuzz based around the vintage Fuzz Master, which in turn is just based off of the old Baz Fuzz. It's based off of taking two Baz Fuzz circuits and slapping them into each other. The component count for this thing is quite small. Doesn't have much going on here. Basically what we got is, well, let's start from the bottom here. We got an array of resistors. We have a single 1K. We have 3 10K. We have a 2.2 mega ohm and a 3.3 mega ohm, which unfortunately I only have a carbon film of, but in this case this pedal is kind of designed with really sloppy tolerances. So carbon film at 5% tolerance for a resistor is not too bad in this instance here. We have ourselves a 1N4001 for a reverse polarity diode to protect the circuit from blowing itself up, basically. We have 2 linear potentiometers. Get over here. So we got 2 100K linear. You can tell by the labeling on it. If it's got a B starting out there, it's linear. If it's got A, it's logarithmic. If it's got a C, it's reverse logarithmic. So this guy is a 100K as well as the other one. And then we have ourselves 3 film or box capacitors. They are all the same value, 100 nanofarad or 1 mic. And then we have an electrolytic capacitor here, which is a 47 microfarad electrolytic there, little can shaped guy. These are polar, so there's a little stripe on here with a negative mark on it. And then we have 2 sets of transistors. We have 3 NPN transistors here. They're MPSA 18s, very high HFE. I believe they're around 1200 HFE on them. And then we have a little smaller PNP transistor, which is a 2N2907. You can get them in different varieties. I think the 2N2907s are now kind of sort of out of print, but you can find different variants like the KSP 2907As, or same deal there. But anyways, let's begin with the assembly. We'll start with the resistors because in a through-hole design they are the flattest things to come up against the board. So we'll just put those on. We'll start with the first resistor here, R1, which is the 1K. It's a good place to start at number 1. So the idea here is we're going to bend the legs at a 90-degree angle right at the actual resistor. And then we're going to just put it on the board. And then what we'll do is we'll bend the leads back to hold it in place so it can't flop around. And we'll just do that now with the rest of the other resistors. And now we have them all in there. Of course, now we have this big mess on the back here. So what I'm going to do is, some people solder on the front of or on the top, and some people solder on the bottom. If you have a desoldering gun, you can actually solder from the top easier and then draw the solder through to the bottom, which is what I'm going to do here. Alright, and now what I'm going to do is just fold up all the back ends here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to trim them down, but I'm not going to trim them perfectly flush quite yet. This is just a little trick that I've developed when working with a desoldering gun. Now if you don't have a desoldering gun, solder on the bottom and then clip them flush. And then what I use is the nozzle tip on my desoldering gun here to basically draw the solder from the top side here where it's a little bit of a glob to the underside. So now it's got a very solid solder joint. Also cleans up all the blobbing that happens. Now, we take our little flat edge cutters, and we cut flush. All right, the next thing we're going to put on is the reverse polarity diode. Now these are pretty common practice diodes here, but you see how it has a stripe on there. Make sure that the stripe that's on the diode matches up with the stripe that is right here on the PCB. Right there. All right, and now we have ourselves a diode on our board. So next thing we typically do here is we determine if we're going to go with next height items here. If I had ceramic capacitors, then those usually are the next shortest things to be flushed up on here, but because the next tallest thing I have are film, we're going to go with the transistors first. So we'll start with the 3 NPN transistors, Q1 through Q3. It's also probably important to note that when you're looking at these guys, this is a TO92 package. So for transistors and MOSFETs and regulators and other things in this can, or TO can type format, notice how it has a curved side and a flat side. And then notice on the PCB board that for like Q1 here, right next to my little guy here, that there's a flat side and then a rounded side. Make sure that they match. That sounds probably pretty basic. And most of you guys probably actually understand this already, but I also understand that this may be the first person's exposure to a soldering video here. So I just want to make sure that everyone has their first time at this, and that first go-around guy sees what's going on here and gets these basic premises down. All right, and that's Q1 through Q3. Now we'll do Q4, which is the PNP transistor. All right. Now we have a fully transistored up PCB. Next thing we'll do is we'll do the film capacitors, and then we'll go with the electrolytic. They're all the same value with the film capacitor, so that makes things easy. They're all the same 100 nanofarad. Alright, now we're up to the spot here where we got all the film capacitors on. We need to get that electrolytic in there. So the trick with the electrolytic is, it's not really much of a trick, but it's kind of one of those things you gotta just do enough times. But you see how here on C6 there's a little plus sign right next to that bottom hole, right next to my little 8-bit guy there. That's to indicate the polarity on the electrolytic capacitor. And you want to make sure that you get that in there correct. Now when you look at a capacitor here, this is a reclaimed electrolytic, so I've already had the legs snapped off of them, which you can usually tell by the length of the legs which side's negative and which side's positive. However, the other way you can tell if the legs have been snipped is you see how there's like this little minus sign on this stripe on this electrolytic. That's how you can tell that that's the negative lead, and therefore the other side's the positive. So keep the positive with the positive and the negative with the negative, you'll be fine. Now there will be some exceptions, rarely, where that's not the case, but those are usually declared specifically in those instances. So the whole top side of the board has been populated. So now we got to do the back. So if we flip this over to the back here, what you will notice is we have two potentiometers here. One is for the volume, and then the other one is for the actual fuzz effect right here. And they're labeled as such. You can also notice that they're kind of flippied around here. This is so that you can stagger the pots and make them fit inside of a 1590A enclosure. So the idea would be basically, if I put them on here, it would look kind of like this. So what I'm going to do here is, this is a question that I get tossed at me a lot, is when I'm soldering pots, as you notice, I don't usually keep the dust shields on the bottom of them, and in a lot of times I don't actually even put any kind of like electric tape or anything in there, and here's why. One of the tricks you can do is when you're soldering these guys down, you're going to solder it in such that there's enough clearance that it can't really touch the bottom with the metal of the potentiometer to these exposed solder joints. But you got to make sure that you do, well, what I'm about to show you right here. So how I do this to make it stable so it doesn't bounce around is I will solder only one leg onto the board. Usually the center pin, because that's the structurally most stable. So now the center leg is soldered, and as you can see, it's flushed up against the board here. But now here's where we get into a little bit of a trick. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to get this on camera and do this at the same time. This is probably not the safest way of doing this. I'm going to lift it out just a little bit. So now you can see that there's a bit of a lift. Then make sure that we get it close to a 90 degree. So now, let's see if we can get that to come in focus. See how there's a bit of a glob on that, as I like to call it, a little Hershey kiss? That's going to give that a lot of structural integrity. Now we're going to do that with the other two legs that I didn't solder yet. So now with the legs like this, there's significant clearance between the top of the pot and the bottom. You'll also know that you got to apply a lot of force just to get it to do anything. So there's not a good risk of stuff touching the bottom there. Now, if you have to, if you don't feel safe with that, sure, put a piece of electrical tape or insulation underneath it, and you'll be fine. But I've gotten away with this stunt many a times. It worked for me. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the other pot. And there you go. You now have both pots on there. Heavy clearance, heavy structurability. Last thing we need to do is just put on our leads. So we have our, going from left to right here, we got input, we have our 9-volt, we have our output, and we have our ground. And that's not the normal order that I normally do on my designs, but in this case, for sake of smallness, that's what I did. Doesn't matter what color wire you use, but try to always stay with the standard that you're going to remember for obvious reasons. For the 9-volt, I typically use red. And there you go. We now have a fully populated and wired up Unshaven Fuzz. So let's hook it up to a test rig here and let's find out how it sounds. Alright, so we got this guy wired in to my little test rig. So here's my clean. Alright, a little dissonant there. So this is basically coming out of my Squire Strat with the actual Fender pickups from Mexi. Single coil going straight into the pedal, going straight into my little Joyo Bant amp. I got the Zombie, but it's on the clean channel, obviously, which is going into a Harley Benton 212 with the vintage Celestion, Celestion vintage 30s. So all right, let's give her a go. So this is just with the volume on a 4 and with the fuzz at 0, which is actually still got fuzz. It's still pretty splatty. It doesn't do single notes very well with the fuzz at 0. See how it's kind of missing some notes on the higher register. But the fuzz is at 0, so it shouldn't really be doing much of any of that. So that's splattiness for you. Let's move the fuzz up a little. And now it's a lot more responsive. So, a lot more response. It's still pretty splatty, but at least the higher notes now actually come through. Let's move this guy up even further. And let's bring it all the way up to the top. A lot of the lower end starts to go away, and I'm going to turn it down just a little on the fuzz, because a perfect 10, you start to lose a lot of that bottom end all of a sudden, and it's due to some of the instability of those circuits for the transistors once it starts getting fully ramped up. You can hear that the bottom end has been cut a lot. And we'll just throw it all the way up to the top here. Yeah, you get a little bit of chaos on that one. Now, what's actually a little bit interesting, though it does sound a little unpleasant with the higher fuzz settings, when you put it in the context of a mix, it sounds actually a lot better, because when it does actually get up there, it is pushing out, or I should say pulling out a lot of the bass, and so it's not nearly as muddy when sitting in the mix. You're actually hitting the frequencies that the guitar is supposed to be sitting in. So there is a little bit of a benefit to that, because it puts the high mids a little bit on emphasis. Personal tastes, I think it pushes it a little too far, but hey, some people like that sound. So there you go. That's the Unshaven Fuzz. That is what an unrefined fuzz sounds like. Cheers.